I think that while we think of rest as kind of a weakness, as it turns out that the right kind of rest is actually a source of great strength for us. And it is something that makes us more creative, it makes us more resilient, it makes us better people.
Welcome to Digital Mindfulness. I'm your host, Lawrence Sampofo. On the show today, I'm here with Alex Soojung-Kim Pang for the second time. Alex came on the show in 2014 when we were talking about the distraction addiction. In this episode, we talk about his new book, Rest, Why You Get More Done When You Work Less. You should listen to this episode if you want to find out about the importance of deliberate rest, what deep play is, and also how the right kind of rest in an always-on society can be a source of strength. But first of all, welcome to Digital Mindfulness. We bring together the best teachers, thought leaders, and entrepreneurs to teach you how to be your best self in an age of digital distraction and information overload. If you're new to our show, then the best place you can find out more about us is if you visit digitalmindfulness.net/start, which has a collection of some required listening podcasts where we discuss everything from becoming more focused in a distracted world to habit building, overcoming digital distraction, cyberbullying, internet addiction, and much, much more. Okay, enjoy the show with Alex Soojung-Kim Pang. Alex, welcome back to Digital Mindfulness. I think you're actually the first person that I've had back on to the show, so welcome back. It's great to have you here.
Hey, it's an honor to be here a second time, to blaze that trail.
So, I guess in the time that you've been on the show, you've moved from focusing on distraction to rest. How did you make that transition? And I guess to me, most importantly, how are the two interlinked?
Right. The short answer is that both of these projects, in a way, came out of the same work that I did when I was at Cambridge about 5 years ago. I had actually 6 years now. I had a sabbatical there in 2011, and was doing the work doing the research that eventually became The Distraction Addiction, my previous book. But while I was there, I also had this experience of living a completely different kind of life than the one that I had here in Silicon Valley. Working in Silicon Valley, working as a consultant, is a lot of projects, long hours, nights and weekends, total multitasking. And when I was in England, on the other hand, I was getting incredible amounts done. I was reading tons and writing a lot, but I felt like my wife and I had incredible amounts of free time. We would go to London and do stuff there and go off to other places on weekends. And I thought, this is nuts, and also wonderful. But, I was getting all this stuff done even while it felt like having a lot more leisure time than I had in my normal life. So, it's that kind of experience, and that's completely counterintuitive if you live your life assuming that in order to do really good work, what you have to do is work really hard for really long periods of time, as I had for most of my adult life. And so after The Distraction Addiction, I came back to this question of how is it possible to, or is it possible to craft ways of working in which you are working fewer hours, but you're actually still doing really interesting stuff, and stuff that's really meaningful. And I'm an historian by training, so my default when I'm thinking about questions is to look to the past, and very quickly found that when you look at the lives of Nobel laureates or great writers or artists in the past, it turns out that a significant number of them work or do what we would regard as work for only about 4 or 5 hours a day. They work very intensively, but that's all they do. And then they go off and do other things. You know, they go off on long walks, they go swimming, they have or of other daily habits. They might come back and do a little bit of, sort of answering letters or other very lightweight stuff for a little bit later in the day. But the core of their work is this concentrated period of about 4 hours. And working in that way, Charles Darwin wrote The Origin of Species. Charles Dickens wrote Great Expectations and many of his other sort of novels. The cartoonist Scott Adams, who created Dilbert, follows this kind of schedule. And an amazing number of people you want to be like work this way. And so I wondered, clearly they know something that we don't, right? And I started thinking, well, maybe it's not that all these people are total super geniuses. Maybe it's not just that they're able to pack like 12 hours of work into 4 hours because of life hacks or other, techniques that they have. Maybe what they did in the other 20 hours actually mattered here, helped make them who they were. And so when I started looking at their leisure, their hobbies, how much they slept, their daily, broadened out and looked at the other parts of their daily schedule and their daily activities, I found that there were some very consistent patterns in not just how they worked, but also how they rested. So they did things like spend a lot of time walking or doing other kinds of exercise. Many of them, many of them defy the stereotype of the creative or the scientist or artist as, this kind of schnurky person who spends all their time indoors and, never gets any exercise. In fact, many of them were avid mountain climbers or hikers or excellent athletes. And their idea of like a daily break was more vigorous than our idea of a workout, right? Charles Dickens would go walking for between 10 and 20 miles every day. And this was like, in those Victorian boots. So, he's not like putting on Under Armour and, and trainers and making it easy on himself. And he's not at all unusual. And so, seeing that they're working they're working less, or they're working fewer hours, that they're following this pattern, that there are consistent ways, not only in the way that they work, but also in the way that they rest, suggested that there really is something interesting here. The last piece of the puzzle came in when I started looking in the literature in neuroscience and the psychology of creativity, which turns out to be full of case studies explaining why it is that, or at least measuring how, things like walking and exercise affect performance on creativity tests, or attention, or the ability to manage complex tasks or hold lots of things in short-term memory. And so there is a body of scientific research that explains why it is that people like Darwin or Einstein or Toni Morrison or Pablo Picasso or Salvador Dali worked the way that they did and rested the way that they did, and why those two things actually worked together to make them super creative and super prolific. Now, so how does this connect to the distraction addiction? Well, the simple answer is that the distraction addiction was about the importance of focus, the importance of concentration in doing good work. And rest turned out, as I realized about 2/3 of the way through it, to be a sequel to this, to the distraction addiction, in that it was about the importance of sort of mind wandering and rest and leisure in doing creative work. And so together, those two books sort of cover the two great things that I think you need in order to do the kind of work that you want. There may be a third, and maybe I'll find, maybe I'll or discover that at some point and write a sequel. But and while I don't get into it very much in rest, it definitely is the case that that just as devices and social media can distract us from focusing in the workplace and doing good work, so too is it every bit as possible for them to distract us from resting well. There are, just last month, there was a study that came out about how people systematically underestimate the amount of time that they spend spend on Facebook. And there actually have been several studies like this now that show pretty consistently that people are really good at underestimating how much time they are on social media, and that it is and that not only is it the case that there's a lot of stuff there that is appealing or distracting, but we also do a really good job of rationalizing our ability to spend small portions of time on those, but actually consuming large portions of time. And so, given that there are only X number of hours in a day, that means less time for other more cognitively beneficial and creatively stimulating activity or leisure, including leisure activity. But it's also the case, it's looking like our brains kind of treat Facebook and Twitter like work rather than like rest, in the sense that when you're seeing what your friends are up to, what conferences they're going to, where they're traveling, you make some of that, as far as your brain is concerned, the work of making sense of that is more like real work than it is like what your brain can do when you kick back and you're binge watching the new season of The Americans or Orange is the New Black. So it turns out to be just as important to be mindful of how you use devices, of how devices want to use you, of their effect on their effect on both your attention and on your ability to let your mind go and to let your mind wander and to think about nothing at all. So that's how those books are connected together.
I really love what you're just talking about and think it's absolutely true. But for a lot of people listening to this, they might just say, do you know what? I don't have the time to work 5 hours a day. The type of job that I do requires me to be online for a lot of the day, if not all day. So what would you say to these people? Why is it so important physiologically and psychologically for us to be able to completely rest?
There is now a century's worth of research that looks at a couple of sort of big questions. One is, what happens to people and organizations when they overwork chronically? The second is, what are the short-term and long-term benefits for people and companies and creativity from vacations and leisure activity? And then the third is, what's the relationship between rest and creativity? So now, for the last 100 years or so, psychologists and organizational sociologists have found that overwork is actually, in the long run, sort of a terrible strategy for people and organizations to pursue, because basically what happens is that it's possible to kind of go into overdrive for brief periods, and I'm talking about like a few weeks. So, when there are, we're talking about like seasonal periods where, projects are due, or there are big trade fairs or tax time or something like that, right? It's a period of, the month where everything is happening, and there's just tons of work, and you got to stay late and do it. Now, people are perfectly capable of handling a few weeks of that and increasing their productivity. After about 8 weeks or so, though, for people working longer than 40 hours, there is a significant drop-off in their productivity, so that after several months, they are no more productive than they are if they're working 40 hours a week. And you also have the problem of increased likelihood of people making sort of mistakes, of errors of judgment. People who are stressed and are chronically overworked are more likely to cheat or to cut corners, which is a problem if you are, in the law or medicine or or doing scientific research or any number of professions, and especially in organizations that are doing highly complex or very precise kinds of work, this can lead to disasters. So, the Samsung 7 debacle, it turns out to be a really good example of this. The story is that Samsung realized that the iPhone 7 was going to be delayed, and they decided that if they could get their new flagship phone out before the new iPhone, that this would give them a leg up in the marketplace. And so everybody in the phone division went into overtime. The engineers were sleeping under their desks for months. You had, and they did titanic amounts of work that resulted in a phone that was absolutely brilliant, with one little problem that nobody had noticed because they were either too tired to pay attention to the details of the testing with the battery, or they had so many things going on that they couldn't pay as much attention to and notice the warning signs that there was a battery issue. And so they ship millions of these things, and it turns out the batteries explode. And I think that is a really important cautionary tale, because more and more of the high value things that we produce, that we consume, the services that we use, depend for their success on working and playing well as part of big complicated systems. And so that means that a mistake that you make can turn out to have gigantic ramifications in a way that it wouldn't if you were making, say, wooden toys. The literature on the long-term consequences of overwork is very unanimous on this point. It's also the case that people who are sort of chronically overworked, who are chronically stressed, are more likely to suffer from things like obesity, heart disease, other kinds of sort of stress-related illnesses, and tend to have higher mortality rates and don't live as long. So that's another reason it's not good for you. The benefits of vacation, on the other hand, are just as well understood and demonstrably are as beneficial as overwork is harmful. So and breaks from work turn out to be both physically restorative but also psychologically restorative. And it turns out we have a pretty good understanding of what kinds of breaks offer the biggest bang for your buck. There was a really interesting study that was done about 25 or 30 years ago of military reservists, and comparing reservists who went off for a month and drove tanks or did other things to people who went on vacation. And it turned out, and we've seen this in studies in the US and the UK and Canada and Israel, that people who return from military service have levels of enthusiasm for their job, resilience, job satisfaction, as high as people who had spent a couple of weeks at the beach. This tells us two things. Number one, that just getting out of the workplace is restorative. But second, that actually doing active things rather than passive things offers a better return on investment in terms of rest. You can also see this in sort of much smaller scale studies. Women executives, for example, who go on business trips tend to find those more restorative than men do, because it means they're not dealing with kids and housework. When you're when you have to fly to Copenhagen to pitch to clients, there's certainly plenty of pressure to do well. On the other hand, someone else is making the bed, and you don't have to worry about doing the dishes. So, that kind of change turns out to be restorative as well. So the benefits of taking regular vacations also extend into longer life, lower rates of heart disease, lower rates of dementias and other kinds of cognitive issues later in life. And so vacations and leisure turn out to be every bit as beneficial as overwork is harmful. And then finally, there's this literature on creativity and leisure and rest. And what we are seeing is that restful activities of those periods where you allow your mind to focus on nothing at all are actually periods where your brain is actually super active. But in the 1990s, scientists who were using fMRI, those brain scanners that show those cool color pictures of your brain doing stuff, discovered that when they put people in fMRI machines and told them to think about nothing at all, just like be as relaxed as you can, their brains actually didn't get quiet. Instead, what happens is that a whole second network of connections between parts of the brain fires up, and it does so really quickly. It turns out that the resting brain is no less active in terms of energy consumption and number of neurons firing than the brain when you're trying to figure out how to get how to drive in traffic in London or do calculus problems or other really complicated things. And furthermore, that resting brain has connections between parts that seem to allow it to explore a wider range of ideas or connections between things than our conscious brains or our conscious minds. And so this helps explain why it is that we all will experience that phenomenon of having sudden aha moments or insights. That thing where you're trying to remember the actress who was in that thing and was also on that in the movie and dated that person, and you can't remember who it is, and then you are you're on your way to work and you realize, wait, that was Scarlett Johansson. that's the default mode network continuing to work on the question of who was that actress, even while you are doing your conscious mind is doing other things. What people who learn to practice deliberate rest are doing, it seems to me, is learning to rest in ways that harness that default mode network, that allow them to, in a sense, outsource some of the work that they are doing to their creative subconscious, so that they are able to solve problems, to formulate insights, without apparently having to work, quote unquote, as hard on them as the rest of us. And indeed, it is arguably the case that this helps explain why some people are as strikingly original as in their work as they are. So Henri Poincaré, the great 19th century mathematician, who had a number of these moments of insight where he worked intensively on a problem and then put it aside, and then weeks later had an answer come to him while he was walking on the cliffs or riding in the bus, said that much to his chagrin, he had to admit that his subconscious mind was the better mathematician, because it was able to come up with solutions to that he, working consciously, could not. And that and that part of his success lay in his ability to recognize that this was so, and to do things that didn't exactly command his creative subconscious, but rather at least kind of nudged it along and encouraged it to work on these questions that had eluded his conscious mind. So that's the science behind deliberate rest. That no matter what kind of work you do, rest is valuable for restoring the mental and psychological energy that you spend during work. It is important because it allows, because it helps prevent problems. It's significant because both the avoidance of overwork and having vacations and serious leisure make you healthier for longer and make your life better, and they also help you be more creative.
So one of the things you mentioned before was that the way that our brains interpret social media use is much the same as work. So it's almost like we're constantly at work by our brain's perception. And I'm wondering whether you think that people are almost too distracted or working too hard to be able to rest properly.
They certainly are. They certainly can be connected. Yes. I think that at a practical level, there is distraction in terms of time that we spend on social media or devices that we could spend doing other more profitable things, things that give us better rest. The second thing, though, I think, is that an important part of triggering and using the default mode network of doing what psychologists call mind wandering, which is the state that you're in when you don't have to focus your attention on anything in particular. It's that zoning out when you're sitting in the back of a car or folding laundry or doing other kinds of mindless activities. The ability to get into that state is, I think, negatively affected by constant engagement with social media, or with digital devices, because rather than when you become accustomed to checking Facebook in line at the grocery store, or checking your email anytime things seem a little, anytime you have a free moment or things start to get boring. I think it becomes harder for you to simply sit and let your mind do nothing at all. And so, while in one sense, trying to get to inbox zero makes you feel like you are more productive and more attentive to your work, the cost is that it subverts your ability to harness this part of your brain that is capable of doing all kinds of great creative things that sometimes exceed your own conscious ability. So I think, that that turns out to be another sort of significant trade-off that we make when we use or become addicted to our social media and our devices.
So I guess then my next question is, how do we get more done when we deliberately rest? Because it almost seems antithetical. Like someone listening to this podcast now might just go to their boss and say, do you know what? I need to, right? I need more time looking out of the window and accessing my and they'll get laughed out of the room. So I'm wondering, how is it that we get more done when we rest?
Right. So, there are the people who are able to do 4 or 5 hours are people who have pretty much total control over their own schedules, right? And if you are not in that position, then I think there are still a couple strategies to pursue. When you look at people like, let's say, generals or neurosurgeons, or people who are or people who still have to work long hours or whose time is not very predictable, when you are even the world's best emergency room doctor cannot predict when the next patient is going to come in. What those people do is their deliberate rest tends to consist of serious hobbies. So they often have these second lives as writers or athletes, or they have some other creative endeavor. And they are very serious about maintaining boundaries between their work life and their home life. So they are rigorous about taking vacations. They often will have they'll often have places that they retreat to, where there's a family rule about no work, no discussions about about office politics, and having those, and so they are and what they find is that both for their own psychological preservation and in order to be more present and more productive when they are in the office, being able to switch off effectively is really critical. I think that this is something that we have tended to lose sight of. There's an assumption that we will be more productive as if we are checking our email at 10 at night or first thing when we get up in the morning, and there is plenty of evidence that suggests that that is not so. So I think that even if you don't have a boss who you can have that kind of have a conversation with about what can happen in the office, there are still things that that you can do in order to give yourself more deliberate rest. Another thing is, as a very practical matter, people who practice this kind of deliberate rest say no to a lot of stuff. They are not exactly minimalists, but they have their work, they have family, and this one other thing that is really good for them, and that's pretty much all they do. But it turns out that's actually a pretty full life. If you find that, find what I call in the book deep play, an activity that is as engaging as your work, but which offers many of the same satisfactions without the frustrations, then that's actually a really terrific thing. So now, for people who are who could bring this up, or who have workplaces that are more project oriented, or bosses who are more data driven, there is an awful lot of research. First off, there's a ton of research that indicates how it is that scaling back on overtime, on shortening the workday, can be a good thing. There are also plenty of companies that are experimenting with shorter workdays, with practices that counter the constant distractions of open offices, of organizing their days to give people uninterrupted blocks of time where they can really focus heads down, and they don't have to have 5 Slack channels open and people coming over every 3 minutes to ask them questions. And so I think that there were companies that show that it really is possible to re-engineer the working day and the workplace so as to give people more time to focus, or a time to focus very intensively, so that they can then get done the critical things that they need to do and get out of the office earlier. And then if you have a lot of control over your time, then I think that the things that separate the people who do really well with that from those who don't are that, first of all, you have a routine that blocks off periods where you're working really hard, very often the super early morning before anybody else is up and before you can really start to distract yourself. And then you also very consciously block out time for walks, or a daily swim, or something else that that takes your mind off work, but is not so engaging that your subconscious can't continue kind of turning over ideas and testing out things. And if you're able to do that, you find that kind of balance, then I think you find that you can actually be very productive at big complex tasks without having to spend enormous amounts of time on them. This is something that I do myself. The 4 or 5 hours, this was something that I started seeing when I was writing The Distraction Addiction. I would get up really early in the morning before my children or wife were awake. It was also so early that I had no interest in looking at Facebook or Twitter, because, if I was going to force myself to get up at 5 a.m., I was actually going to get stuff done. And nobody else was awake anyway. And I found that if I did that by 10 in the morning, I had written, a few pages, and I felt really good about it. And, and I am someone who previously had, generally started work at 9 or 10 at night, and assumed that you burn the midnight oil, and that's how creative people worked. But I found that that working in this way, with this much more measured pace, I've been able to write 2 books in the last 5 years, and which is a pretty good record so far. So my own life tells me that this is a better way of working than the one than the heroic 90-hour week or of, style, or of erase the boundary between work and life style that we've come to think is both desirable and inevitable.
It's interesting though, because I think that we have to, not only in companies but in ourselves, build this rest culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's and it is a culture, it's a way of thinking, and I'm wondering what you, obviously, you've got your company, which I hope you go on to talk about, but I'm wondering how you would advocate doing this, because I know even recently Donald Trump, it was revealed that apparently that he only sleeps 3 hours a night, and Margaret Thatcher only 4 hours a night, and these people are celebrated, and actually when you go into a lot of companies, the metric for success is all about the time that we spend in the office doing stuff, producing things. Right. It's all optimized for efficiency. So it's almost like, how do you get that culture change to shift from efficiency to doing our best work?
Right. Well, I think the first thing to point out is that long hours are actually not so much about efficiency, because the assumption is, it's almost like assuming that if you can do in 12 hours a task that someone else can do in 1 hour, that you're going to hire the 12-hour person, which is obviously not the case. Now, I think that we need to recognize that for a bunch of reasons, we treat the amount of time that people spend working as a measure of their commitment and their productivity, when in fact it measures neither. There are, I think that that if you are, there are only some very specific fields where a relationship between time and income is, really holds. If you're a lawyer and you're billing people basically by the minute, then yeah, the more time you spend with a client, the more money you're going to make. But generally, that relationship is a lot less clear than we believe. But we believe it because we've grown up in a world in which our exemplars are people like Margaret Thatcher or Steve Jobs or Elon Musk or hedge fund managers, people for whom success meant working intensely long hours, often in a kind of race against the clock, whether it was a race against the next election or the next turn in the economy or turn in Moore's law, which meant that they had, if they were going to make their mark, they had to do so now, and thus rationalizing, or apparently rationalizing, titanic numbers of hours. It's also the case that that living in an economy that is both sort of more global and more uncertain, that employers have been able to demand longer hours from their workers, from their workforce. And always, behind this is the implicit or occasionally explicit threat that if you don't put in these long hours, we can easily find someone who will. And then finally, there's been this weird sort of culture shift that has happened among professionals, which is that it used to be the case that having leisure was a mark of your success. But today, the equation is flipped. The real status comes from being super busy, and if you are overcommitted, if lots of people want your time, this shows that you are in demand, that you're successful, that you're doing work that's significant. And leisure, in contrast, has come to be seen as either kind of shady or as something that the truly successful, busy person shouldn't need or shouldn't have time for. So all of these things together, I think, or help create this sense of inevitability and inescapability of sort of busyness and overwork. That is not to say that, but I say the appearance of their inevitability. I think it's still the case that we have room to maneuver and we have room. It is possible, to change things. That it is possible for us to recognize that, that these are habits that we pick up from a world that actually hasn't really thought them through and designed them carefully. And that there are other better ways of organizing our work, of managing our people, of managing our attention, and that these other ways will actually allow us to do better work and to be better people.
It's a real shame that we, I think us in our offices and the way that we approach work, that we tend to think that the more time that we spend in the office equates to the more success that we have. So it's really like an industrial model of production, that the more uptime there is, then the more successful we'll be, when rather maybe we should be thinking about the extent to which we do our best work as the measure of our success.
Right. Yeah, which arguably is the case if all you are doing is filling tubes with gunpowder. But, even in those, however, the first studies showing that overwork led to all those problems that I talked about before were actually done in British munitions factories during World War I. Around 1916 or so, the government realized that these factories were running at 60 or 80 hours a week and people were working 7 days a week, but they were no more productive than they had been a year earlier. And that led them to ask, okay, so what is it that's going on? Are people shirking? Are there communists who are, undermining, or the workflow? And it turned out, no, it's simply that this kind of chronic overwork is unsustainable for the reasons that the researchers then sort of discovered, and which have been confirmed time and time since in a variety of different kinds of workplaces and across professions, ranging from factory work to law enforcement to medicine to nursing to the law and to the military.
So we spoke earlier about the importance of deep play as a way to get deliberate rest, but what are the other ways that you managed to get into this state of deliberate rest?
So, I am really unapologetic now about taking naps. So I think that, at a daily basis, that is one of my biggest changes. In the afternoon, rather than, having another cup of coffee and trying to force my way through something that I'm working on, I will take a nap for 20 minutes, and that offers as good a mental refresh as anything else I can do, and I find I am much more productive for the rest of the afternoon. For me, also, I find that, like a lot of my creative exemplars in the book, that having a routine where you are, where that focuses on, intensive periods of work, and then declaring oneself essentially done for the day, kind of pacing out your work so that you think about completing tasks over the course of a couple days rather than one giant heroic burst, is really important for doing a lot of good work. Another important thing that I've realized is working in the early morning, and for me, two essential parts of that are, first of all, setting up as much as I possibly can the night before, so that when the alarm goes off at 5 or 5:30 and I stagger up out of bed, I don't have to think about doing anything. I've set up the coffee the night before. I have sugar in the mug sitting beside it. I have the list of things that I'm going to work on already written out on my desk, that, and all I have to do is put on clothes, which are already at the foot of the bed, stagger over to the coffee machine, pour coffee, go over to the desk, lift up the lid of the laptop, and start writing. I don't have to make a single decision about, what do I work on? Or do I get out of bed? Do I not get out of bed? Do I have coffee or tea? All that stuff is worked out for, I've made all those choices the night before so that I can just focus exclusively on the work. The other thing that I do is stop in mid-sentence the day before. This is something that Ernest Hemingway talked about doing, which was that his advice to writers was never start the day looking at a blank page. That you always stop when you have a sentence or two left in the paragraph, so that when you get back, first of all, when you get back to it the next morning, you're not faced with the existential terror of not knowing what you're going to write first, but instead you can kind of ease into it. But Hemingway also said that there was a second benefit to this, which was that it gets your subconscious mind thinking about not just the next paragraph, but the next page and the next chapter. That for him, it was a technique for getting his subconscious working on his behalf while he was out, marlin fishing or, going to bullfights. And there were a lot of writers who find that this is the case, that leaving a little bit for the next day helps them get started, makes it easier to just get into the rhythm of writing, but it also seems to help their creative minds continue working on the plot or the story or the problem, even while they're off doing other things. And I've become a big believer in this. I find that that it is a great technique, and I've had, some of my best ideas, I think, come when I've been working on something the day before and I just let it kind of cogitate. And then early the next morning, before I'm really fully awake, I'll write something and it will, turn out to be the answer to this problem, or, the resolution of some technical issue that I've been working on. And, did I work out the solution while I was dreaming? Did I do, was there exactly when the answer came to me? I don't know. But the fact is, it's there. So when that happens, it's a really terrific feeling.
So, Alex, now that you're on this journey from addiction to rest and deliberate rest, what would you say are the most important human traits, and how do we cultivate those?
That's an interesting. That's an interesting question. I've been thinking about this partly in the context of, debates about automation and the erosion of, the ability of robots to do increasingly sophisticated tasks that, not just blue collar workers or manual workers do, but also, white collar and professionals. And, it really raises the question, what are humans good for, right? If algorithms and soft robots are capable of doing, diagnosing, diseases or reading x-rays or so forth, then why do we need workers at all? And I think that the one thing that really does still distinguish people from robots is our capacity to rest well and to be creative. That it is for all of the kind of cool and quirky things that, let's say, IBM's Watson is able to do in creating movie trailers, or that Google's artificial intelligence division has been able to do in terms of making a system that's capable of creating dreamlike images. Those are kind of interesting, but they are nowhere near what humans are still what humans are capable of doing. And I think that while we think of rest as kind of a weakness, as it turns out that the right kind of rest is actually a source of great strength for us. And it is something that makes us more creative, it makes us more resilient, it makes us better people. And so, but I think that in that in strict economic terms, that the human capacity for thinking creatively is the single most important thing that we have in our favor. And it's also the case that kind of creativity is not just something that you exercise like when you're working on an ad campaign or doing medical research. That kind of creativity is something that we need to be able to draw upon in our daily lives, when we're dealing with family stuff or managing children. And so that's, it's not just like creativity with the big C, the kind that yields, the Sistine Chapel. But modern life demands actually a lot of creativity in order to navigate through and deal with its various challenges, and to live well. So it is essential both as a thing that distinguishes humans, but it's also important as a thing that helps make us human.
Alex, where can people find out more about you and Restful? And
so the Deliberate Rest blog, which talks about the book and sort of new research in creativity, new experiments in the workday, that is at deliberate.rest. Rest is actually now a top level domain. So I was quick to grab that URL. And then the Restful company is restful.company. So, and that explains sort of what it is that the Restful company does and how to get in touch. And then on Twitter and pretty much every other platform that I am on, I have the username AskPang, AskPang. So I'm pretty easy to find.
I think, Alex, this has been such an important episode, just like learning just how important it is to rest. And again, just that distinction from, let's be our best selves, not just our busiest selves, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Just so important. And yeah, thanks so much for coming on again and sharing that with us. I really appreciate it.
It's been a real pleasure, Lawrence.